Today we're meeting freelance journalist Urban Hamid, and we're doing an interview with him here on the rooftop on his cousin's house in Basra. Hello, Mr. Urban Hamid.
Hello, Mr. William Stockstad.
We are in Iraq for the first time together, but you've been here several times before. How long have you been covering the Middle East?
Let's see, since 2003 full-time, and before that sort of part-time.
Just before we left, you started a new podcast about Iraq. How come you started it right now?
Well, first of all, I have to maybe make it clear that it's not just about Iraq, but Iraq is sort of the segue into the Middle East. So in other words, it will be about the Middle East. And the reason why I chose to begin now is that on the 20th of March 2003, that is more than 15 years ago, the invasion of Iraq started. So I decided to have that as some kind of starting point. I'm trying to give a background so that people can understand why things are the way they are in Iraq, and also in a way why things are happening the way they are in other parts of the region, because they're all connected.
We just came from Mosul a couple of days ago. Can you tell us a bit about what we saw up there and your thoughts on the situation in Mosul?
Well, first of all, I have to admit that although I've seen lots and lots of destruction and whatnot, I wasn't prepared for what we saw in Mosul. I think that the devastation, the destruction of the city in some parts were shocking. Whenever it comes to a conflict, one has to remember that the victims are always the people, always the civilians, and to see people that are without homes, without jobs, and just trying to survive. And what's, I would say, perhaps even more shocking is not just the lack of understanding of the situation, but the blatant lack of humanitarian help, of trying to help the families that are now in such dire straits.
So during our time in Mosul, we focused mainly on the situation of the children, and
the situation for the children is extremely bad. Some of the children have been refugees, internally displaced people, as it's called, for about 3 years, and they haven't been able to attend school. And this is a disaster for children, because the way the educational system is set up in Iraq, it's all of your education is geared towards like a gradual exam that basically determines your future. If you add, all the trauma that the children have been going through, either because they have been, like I said, internally displaced, or because they have been in Mosul or in the conflict areas and firsthand witnessed destruction, witnessed perhaps family members being killed or tortured. the trauma is tremendous. And I am so concerned if the international community doesn't do its best at this point to help the children and to improve their situation. I think that this last disaster, this last terrorist organization, IS, the Islamic State, will be replaced by something even worse. So it's, I think we are at a point when it's, the international community has to come together and try its very best.
And reporting on a situation like this, especially talking to children, children who have experienced, have these experiences and sometimes trauma. What should you think about as a reporter when dealing with that? Because it's a quite sensitive situation as well.
I think that you sort of, in your question, touched upon something very important, and that is trauma. One has to realize that these children are traumatized, which means that one has to be careful not to trigger these sort of effects, because if they cannot get any help when they sort of experience or get flashbacks of things that have happened, you never know what the consequences are going to be. That's one thing. The other thing is that you also have to realize that traumatized people, and especially children, they sometimes, how should I say, lack the ability to make a balance. So they perhaps provide you with details of their family, of their history, that is not only detrimental to their health, their mental health, it could also have an impact on their security, their safety. They might give out the information that in the end could be could constitute a danger to themselves and their family. So that's one thing we as journalists have to think about, and sometimes you even have to think about, well, is it ethical to actually ask to interview children? I think that's one of the key issues here. We have to really think about that.
Yeah, and as journalists, of course, we have a great responsibility not to put people in any danger. I mean, we're there to report, but definitely not do any more harm. And Iraq and Mosul have been very heavily reported on. With Mosul as an example, we saw stories about the battle for Mosul in almost every news outlet. I heard that there were at times 600 journalists on the ground at the same time. What do you think about the media's responsibility to follow up on that kind of reporting?
For instance, from the humanitarian point of view, I think that news coverage focusing on that particular issue would perhaps provide the information and the details needed for politicians, and both in Iraq, but perhaps more so in outside Iraq, so that they realize the graveness of the situation and provide needed help. And I do think that we as journalists, we have to make sure that this is not just one of these stories that, okay, so now Mosul has been liberated, the Islamic State has for the most part been defeated, that now we can move on and do something else. We go to the next conflict. I think that we really have to have the stamina and the patience to continue covering what's happening here. We do have a big responsibility in making sure that those 600 journalists who were here at the peak of the offensive, that they come back and give us, or rather give the readers and the news consumers a fresh picture of what's happening right now. That is our responsibility.
Okay, so thank you very much for being in this episode. Thank you for lending me your microphone. And I mean, we are gonna be here together for at least another week or 10 days or something. So we'll probably show up in another episode as well. But yeah, thank you for taking the time.
Well, thank you.